Hey, everybody. It is The Broken Brain. It is our weekly look at history, particularly history of culture and psychology. Once a month, we have an entire episode of this. It's my Thursday History lesson of history. And this is the 1 week within the month where this is available to everybody who is listening to the feed, the main feed, instead of just being available to the patrons of the show, which the other weeks of the month. We do this every week, and you may hear the samples of a couple minutes here and there of the other episodes. But if you are interested in the full episodes every week about historical reference to psychology, then consider going to patreon.com/broken brain to learn more about how you do that by contributing to the show. And thank you. Deep thank you to all of those of you who are doing that, and to those of you who support by listening and especially by sharing this with other people. Really do appreciate that. I'm going to be a little self-indulgent on this one and talk about a topic I want to. Hey, guess what? That's what I do every week. I I pick these things based off of what I think is interesting. Always open to your suggestions as well. If you want to let me know, you can go to dwighthurst.com/contact for that kind of stuff. But today I'm going to talk about something that is in the spirit of the winter holidays. It is related to Christmas. It is Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol and adaptations of that. There's several things that have to do with the psychological impact on human beings and the spirit of that. So hopefully, if that's not of interest to you, then sorry, but hopefully this will be. And if not, at least the aspects of it that are applicable to us, I think there's some universal aspects as human beings that we can find in this particular story. It is a very powerful story, and it has persisted over the years. I think just as much, if more than many, and as much as any work of fiction. It's like we see a new version of it coming out all the time, and many of those are good. I'll mention a few of them today that I like about parts of them. But so I'm going to go into a couple different aspects of A Christmas Carol that have some psychological relevance to our lives. So I want to mention first the humanization and dehumanization of the protagonist. First, Ebenezer Scrooge. And I think that there is a mistake that's often made in his portrayal. Do we want to, if you're going to make a play or a show or a fan fiction involving characters from My Little Pony or the X-Men or whatever, or you want to make a Doctor Who episode that mirrors it as well, in the Matt Smith years particularly. Any of those things. If you want to make an iteration, you have to decide, how evil do we make this guy? When you go back to the original story, one of the things that's very interesting is I don't get the sense that this is an evil man. This is a person. This is a real legitimate person. And one of the things that is interesting is before this was being talked about in as many places, Dickens included the aspect of trauma and how trauma played a role in the development of Scrooge's character and of his behaviors. This is someone who, as we find out, grew up in a circumstance in which he seems to. There's some indication that he had lost his mother at a young age. He is sent off to school and has a separation. There is part of his reflections of the past. His sister lets him know that his father is nicer now when she comes to see him. We don't know if he really is nicer, but that would indicate that he wasn't always nicer, guys. Nicer requires there to be meaner before, right? And learning along the way to define himself. And this goes back to my understanding is Dickens' own life experience, which is the crushing weight of poverty. There's a line in the original story where Scrooge says in frustration, there is nothing that the world is harder on than poverty, and there's nothing it condemns more than the pursuit of wealth. I may not have got that verbatim, but it's about the same. And that's true. When you're looking at someone who is a protagonist slash antagonist in a good story, they often say things that are true. The Joker in the movie The Dark Knight has a few key quotes where he says, if something horrible happens that's according to the plan, no one remembers it. If something bad happens that wasn't supposed to happen, everyone goes crazy, right? That's true. Now, the behaviors that it spawns, not always good. And that's where you get the conflict in the story. Scrooge obsessively pursues this to the point where it costs him relationships. It costs him his primary romantic relationship in his life. It keeps him very much at a distance from anyone, including those who could very well be his friends, right? So there is damage. There is unhealthy behaviors that this indicates. However, uh, and this will be, I'm going to get into my second point here, which is the reflections on and the healing process and how that's affected by the three ghosts. But you see right away that very soon into these encounters, he starts to doubt his behaviors when he's traveling into the past and he sees how nice his boss was to him when he had nothing. He says, I wish I could talk to Bob Cratchit a little bit right now, right? So he knows. He knows. He catches on. He's not a monster. He's just a guy who's, being super crummy for a long time. That's not to let him off the hook. In fact, there's a line that's inserted in there. There's the famous line where he says, well, if people are going to die, they better just get to it and decrease the surplus population. What isn't included in any iteration that I've ever seen other than, the book, which is the original iteration, is that the very next thing he says to these people who are asking him for money is, but I don't want to know that, or I don't know that, something like that. Basically, he says, I'm not aware of that. I don't know if that's true. I don't know that it's happening, meaning I don't want to. I'm trying not to be aware of that. It bothers me. It shakes the philosophy that I have. I'm adding a lot here, but how many times do we choose to turn a blind eye? Right? So, I mean, let's look at the healing process. And you can say that even before the three ghosts get there, there's obviously the first ghost is actually his dead partner, probably one of the only people in his life you could say maybe kind of a friend, maybe just a little. But here's an interesting thing is that through the intervention of other people, we oftentimes can disrupt unhealthy patterns because someone cares. And in this case, here's someone who, as far as we know in the story, there's nothing in it for him other than he's interested in helping this guy that he knew. As far as we know, he's still condemned. He's still strolling around. And I think there's a lot of misunderstandings I'm going to hit on here. I think that what's sad about Marley's experience is not that he's wearing chains. It's not just, you're bad, wear these chains, you're in hell, we're punishing, right? It's not that. The thing that he complains the most about in the story is, I see somebody over here who needs help and I can't help them anymore, and I wish I could. I realize that's important now. And during the part that you don't see all the time is when Scrooge sees all of these many people, you has this partial vision. You see this in the musical Scrooge, starring Albert Finney, famously the guy who helped Jason Bourne learn to kill. At least that was another role. Albert Finney himself didn't do that. But as far as I know, I won't Google him and find out if he's training assassins for the government. But I think that was just a character he played in one of the Bourne movies. Slight spoiler for the Bourne movies, I guess. Anyway, he has this vision where he sees all these other people other than Marley. And it specifically in the story mentions that several of them are looking at a woman who seems to be homeless with a child and just wailing, just really upset that they can't do anything. And the implication is that they would have been able to in their lives, that they were all possessed the resources and did not use them appropriately. And the mourning of that is really what the chains are a metaphor for, I think, not just punishment for being naughty, which we sometimes focus on too much. I'll get back to that in a second. But the three ghosts are very interesting because when you see the ghost of past, present, and yet to come, as it's called, not just future, I guess, you see something that I think in modern terms, if we're doing therapy, you could call them the ghosts of processing trauma, the ghost of mindfulness, and the ghost of healthy goal-directed behavior, right? So you look at this. Do we process the past? I've talked a lot about trauma processing, and trauma processing often has to do with visiting and considering the experiences that have put me somewhere. That applies to lots of other things that happen in our lives, mental illness and the habits that we formed, compulsions, addictions, those kinds of things, high risk self-destructive behaviors. When we get into that, it is important, or the context of that can be important for us to understand. And even with other people, the context sometimes allows us to avoid hating someone, to if we move towards either forgiveness or trying to release experiences that we've had to some extent to where they're not driving our feelings anymore. Processing the past can be helpful. In modern trauma techniques, we don't always delve obsessively into the past, but if we are looking for self-discovery, I've noticed that even through trauma techniques like EMDR or IFS, or now ART is a big one that I'm learning about, there are things that tend to reduce the crisis part, somatic techniques as well. We had Dr. Bertelli, who came on a few weeks ago, talking about that, how just some of those techniques help. They may reduce the crisis and panic associated with our traumatic experiences. But even then, I find that almost everyone I work with, they often then want to visit and talk about the things they learned and maybe the bad habits they've formed, or just process the hurt. Even if I'm not in panic mode anymore, I might want to talk about it. And I might benefit in a way of self-exploration by saying, oh, this happened. That's why I started to do that, right? And so that's helpful. Now, the ghost of present, there's a big emphasis there on mindfulness, living in the moment. Not only living in the moment for ourselves, although there is an indication of appropriate pleasure and enjoyment that we could take that Scrooge was denying himself by cutting himself off from other people, right? But also having the mindfulness, the present focused thinking, to also notice what is going on around me. Okay. There is, I think it's only the version with George C. Scott in it that I've seen this. I'm not sure. Well, the Muppets Christmas Carol, probably my favorite version, actually. They basically go around and see people partying. But in the other version and in the book, there's a whole journey that Scrooge goes on with this ghost, looking at people who are existing in situations that are not great, right? Looking at people who are hungry. They even fly out and look at some sailors on a ship at some point, and how they're trying to take some notice of Christmas and that spirit of the holiday, right? And noticing that people are around. Okay. What is the vision of the Cratchit's Christmas, if not being mindful of circumstances around? And then of course, let's contrast that with seeing his nephew Fred's party on Christmas. That is definitely different and more of a position of wealth and privilege than Bob Cratchit's household. The unifying factors are you're seeing people who are pitching into those relationships, who are being mindful and completely trying to live in that present moment in a way that is healthy. For Scrooge, it's a mindfulness and awareness of someone he should be helping, the Cratchits, obviously, or at least his employee, right? And being aware and being a human being who has the ability to help. Also, though, he needs help, right? His nephew, the one surviving member of the family other than him, Fred, I guess it would be, is it Fred Scrooge? No, it probably wouldn't be, because it was his sister's son, and I don't know. Anyway, whatever. I don't know if I know Fred's last name. Haven't read that in a while. I don't think it's in there. There's a little trivia if anyone can find out Fred's last name, if he even has one. He's a fictional character. If it doesn't exist in the story, he doesn't have one. But Ebenezer Scrooge could use some family. He could use someone who cares about him enough to say, come over and have dinner with me. We want to love you. We want to accept you. And even to the point where he's super nasty. And Fred, their last interaction in the first act of the story is, well, I'm going to stay in a good mood. Love you anyway. Hope you come to dinner. And, that's a person who could help him. And so not only should he be helping and taking advantage of that healing, but being helped by someone else who cares about him. The yet to come, the big ghost who looks like death. And here's where we over focus on death in this part. He shows up, and there is the fear and anxieties of the future. I've heard many people say that anxiety often comes from the future, or our brain's ability to process and imagine what could happen. And so Scrooge goes into this very bleak future. And death is a big part of those visions that he sees, not only the death of Tiny Tim and the effect that has on that family, but his own death. And his own death isn't really what's scary to him. if we really think about it, okay? Think about the way that this rolls out. He comes into the future and he sees a bunch of people talking about a person who died. And they're saying like, meh, he died. Huh, that's interesting. Yeah, it's not that interesting. Whatever. He sees a pawn shop where there's people selling this person things. Now, if you want to get a little analytical in the story, it's possible that he may have picked up on already who this person might be. I mean, they were his possessions, right? And he probably knew the people who were there. And it's like now he asks to see some tenders. This is showcased in the Muppet Christmas Carol, where Michael Caine, who you might know to recognize from Funeral in Berlin or the 1970s version of Get Carter and the remake. Anyway, he literally asks the spirit to show him some tenderness associated with death so that scene doesn't haunt him forever. That's when he gets to see the Cratchits and the mourning process, a much healthier mourning process than the absence of mourning that is seen people being like, hey, do you want to buy these bed sheets I ripped off of a dead person? And then there's the famous scene where he, checks out the tombstone, the gravestone, and doesn't want to look at it, but he has to look at it and it has his name on it. He's dead. I think sometimes we make a mistake of thinking that the sad part is that he's dead. Now, here's the thing. Scrooge is old. He's going to die. He knows that. Death is a huge part of this whole time of life, by the way. It's, you die from a cold or whatever, and you didn't live as long back then. So he knows he's going to be dead, and I think we get that. The thing that is horrifying about that death, and I'm gonna give you my favorite portrayal of this, and it's actually not a retelling of A Christmas Carol. It's from the movie The Man Who Invented Christmas, which is a historical fictionalized version of Charles Dickens writing A Christmas Carol. And Charles Dickens, very well played by Dan Stevens, who you might remember as the guy, the wax figure come to life whose nose melted in Night at the Museum 3. For those of you who haven't noticed, I like to use obscure references with actors. It's my own little private joke with myself. If you don't think it's funny, too bad. It's part of it's part of listening to me. I know he was on Downton Abbey, you guys. But in this version, it really delves into Charles Dickens' past and things. And as any movie that showcases a creative process does, they have to find a way to make writing a story look interesting to an observer. Is it internally interesting? Sure, but it's a lot of hard work that's, not any writer will tell you sitting down and writing is like, okay, that's the worst part of writing, right? But there's always a way in a movie, and the way that they showcase this is that he tends to imagine scenes. He imagines the characters. And Christopher Plummer plays the imaginary manifestation of Ebenezer Scrooge. And, most of the time is like, yelling at him. They're arguing because he's Scrooge. He's kind of a dick. He's having arguments. He's belittling Dickens when he can't think of how to, tell the story and all that kind of jazz. But it's the best depiction of the graveside feelings. And Plummer, of course, great actor, You may remember him as the voice of the Pixie King in the 2015 animated show Pixies. Anyway, but okay, so Christopher Plummer, the way he plays this though is adeptly acted, but in the dialogue he talks about, I don't want to die this way. I don't want to be forgotten. I don't want people to rejoice in my death. Once again, with the Albert Finney version, the musical Scrooge, which is mostly a musical. It's lighthearted, and they do this in a lighthearted as possible way. But in the scene where, they have a whole scene in there that's not in the book, where a whole neighborhood of people, which are meant to be, I think, the debtors who owe money to Scrooge, are having a literal song and dance routine, literally dancing on his coffin because they're so happy that he's dead, right? And so there's this thing. And so much more deeply emotional is that scene with Plummer, where he is talking about, this is not the way we want our lives to be. And in that story, in the historical fiction of that movie, I have no idea how realistic this is. Dickens is very much on the fence about, is Scrooge going to be saved? Or is it a better story if he isn't? And it's just a sort of almost a morality tale. It's like the classic writer's decision to kill or not kill a character, right? Um, and ultimately, the decision is to try to wrap up redemption into this. It's a pretty good movie. It has a whole lot to do with his relationship with his own father, and whether or not it's historically accurate. I mean, most of those aren't, so I don't know. But Dickens himself was kind of a problematic individual, as is my understanding of the real guy. But either way, this idea of redemption, and this is another part that is very, very healthy, and I believe a great way to end it is it's obviously a Christmas upbeat kind of a thing, but the idea is that Ebenezer Scrooge has this chance from this point on. Once again, y'all, he's old. We don't necessarily have any indication of thinking just because he's nicer now he's going to live any longer, right? Um, Maybe, I don't know. But at the same time, he is going to live however long he's going to live. And when is it too late for us to start doing the right things and the healthy things? Well, it's never too late. Today is always the best time. There's that old saying, the best time to plant a tree, right? Best time is 20 years ago. Second best time is right now, right? And so that's kind of the emphasis of that. Interestingly enough, in a movie, they always try to find a way to make it look interesting. And, I don't remember which movie it was. One of the movies that I've seen of this depicts this the way it is in the book. Most movies show Ebenezer Scrooge buying a big old, having a kid buy a big old turkey. In a musical adaptation like The Muppets or the musical Scrooge, he buys a bunch of toys, literally brings half of London to the Cratchit's house. It's very endearing. It's very fun, right? And the idea of him having this encounter where he's like, I'm going to pretend to be grumpy and then I'm going to be nice, right? Now, that part's in the book. But what actually happens is in the book, he does send gifts and food, particularly he sends the goose. I don't remember if there's any toys, but he sends the goose to the Cratchits anonymously, chuckles about it. Then he goes to his nephew's party and is with his family, right? Then we flash forward to the next day where he actually waits at the counting house. And it even details he's hoping that Bob Cratchit's going to show up late after making merry the day before or whatever. He's like, because then he can pretend to be grumpy even better, right? So he is. He's a few minutes late, and he comes in, and Scrooge is like, "Where have you been? And what are you?" Blah, blah, blah. That's the dialogue. And Cratchit, of course, is like, "I'm in trouble. I'm going to be, lose my job," which, by the way, is a death sentence potentially in that era, as it can be. Oftentimes, could be very, very bad anytime. But that's he's got a family of people who could all starve without this, right? This is where jobs were differently important when we watch those period pieces, and we forget in some cases it could also involve, many people live in servants were homeless if they were fired, right? Homeless and starving. Even people who worked in retail establishments sometimes lived in quarters that were attached to it. I think even Scrooge himself slept on the floor or under a desk or something in the Fezziwig establishment. Or Fozziwig, if you're Muppets Christmas Carol stan, that character was played by Fozzie. But regardless, he says to Cratchit, "I need to pay you more." When he shows that he's nice now, I need to pay you more. You know what? We should sit down and talk about your affairs. We should talk about your family. Let's go have lunch. Even they go out, and I think it says over a bowl of smoking bishop. I don't have any idea what the hell that is. So if anybody out there is either British or lives in that era and is a time traveler listening to this podcast, I'd love to know what that is. I could Google it, actually. Didn't do that for today. That is not the point of this episode, really. But so, he says, we're going to take you out and we're going to talk about your financial affairs and I'm going to pay you better. Now, he does not actually go out and rip up his collection book and, impoverish himself like is so often indicated in some of the movies as well. Once again, you need something dramatic to put on screen, especially if it's, a fun, spirited musical thing. I think in the musical Scrooge, Albert Finney literally is shown going out in the streets and saying, "No one owes me money anymore," which For a money lender, I'm not sure what he did after that, but hey, maybe he retired. But either way, I don't fault the movies for being a little more dramatic in that way. But here's the indication I like from the story. You have to kind of connect the dots on this. What is he going to do? Is he going to change professions? It's kind of a tough, profession to be a good guy in, I'm sure. Or is he just going to be a bit nicer? We often have scenes in the movies of him just being horrible to people. But other than, the people coming collecting money and everything, we don't really have an indication except that there's some, narrative in the prose where we are told in the third person that he's a hard hand at the grindstone, that he's basically not a guy you want to piss off or owe money to. But what's he going to do about this? And that's his task to take forward. So I like that little part of it. I like in stories myself. I like it when not everything is tied up in a neat little bow and we have to kind of think about what is this person going to do next? That's another principle psychologically. When we're trying to heal and when we're trying to do things in our lives for good and for improvement and any of that, we have to understand that it's not a linear journey. We're not just going to get better and better and better. I don't like the phrase, we'll just do a little bit better every day. I get the sentiment behind it, but I don't really like it because I think it's an potentially unhealthy thought. We don't do better every single day. I don't do my best every day. My best may change over time. It may diminish or grow. And also, I'm not going to live up to my best person every day. And so, those are some things that you can take with you. If you haven't read the story and if you are at all open to it, I'd recommend it. I think that reading it gives you, not only does it give you some of these little insights you might not see in the movies, but it's also just very beautifully written. Aside from anything else Dickens was, he's very masterful with wordplay and with metaphor and just all that jazz. And by the way, my recorder has a pause function on it, which is why I was able to look up what Smoking Bishop is. I felt guilty that I didn't know. Apparently, according to punchdrink.com, it was actually a cocktail. It wasn't food. It says, in a final scene from A Christmas Carol, Scrooge turns to Bob Cratchit, his belittled employee, with new eyes and invites him to be merry over a bowl of Smoking Bishop. The word bishop was a 19th century code for port. So this referred to a roasted clove and orange-infused port punch warmed and mulled with baking spices. You can decide for yourself if that sounds good or utterly horrifying. That's totally up to you. But I just thought that's my little present to y'all. Now, in keeping with the tradition here at the Broken Brain, the week of Christmas, I generally will replay some of our popular episodes from the past where we covered some of those things. Anyone who is not into Christmas or, not necessarily Christian focused or any of culturally or philosophically or anything, I'm sorry if I hope that doesn't make anyone feel left out, but that is the experience that I have that I can, share with everybody, and hopefully that works okay for people. But I will be replaying some of those as well as a new one. Oftentimes we have a little fun talking about a Christmas special and what that feels like. So hopefully that week of Christmas, I'll drop several episodes that will be focused on that. People can kind of have a little fun with that, as well as hopefully, we try to talk about some of the elements of that. Now, for the month of December 2024, very important for me to mention our charity of Focus. This is the charity that I will be donating 50% of the Patreon donations to if you become a patron in this month. And as always, if you want to change the charity from the one that was the charity of the month when you got in to one that is new, just hit me up on the website, contact me either on Patreon or dwighthurst.com/contact, like I said before, and just let me know if you ever want to do that. But the charity this month that you should check out is the Prince Edward Island Transgender Network, which is a nonprofit that works with and advocacy and support, and just they do a lot of different things for the transgendered individuals in the Prince Edward Island area of Canada and the surrounding areas there. You can go to PEITN, that's the acronym, Prince Edward Island Transgender Network, PEITN.com, in order to learn more about that nonprofit organization. And I would encourage you to do so, whether or not you donate to the Patreon and you donate that way and get and help out the show here, or whether you go and support them directly. I would, if you can do both, whatever it is you choose to do. It also doesn't cost anything, by the way, to tweet out or X out or Facebook out or whatever it is. If you share something on your socials, with their website address or anything like that, but, that doesn't cost anything other than a few seconds. And let's be honest, we're on our phones more than that anyway. Be back with you again next week with some new information, new episodes. All right. Have a great day.